The sky over my hometown tears open like wet paper, and I do not have time to be afraid. My name is Ellie Cade, and 3 hours ago I was drinking coffee in my kitchen. Now I am lying flat in a drainage ditch outside Millbrook, watching a shape the size of a small mountain slide silently across the clouds. It makes no sound. That is the part that frightens me most. Something that big should roar. Instead it glides overhead like it is embarrassed to be seen, and dust rains down from the underside of its hull and settles on my shoulders like snow. My phone is buzzing in my pocket. I do not answer it. I already know what it will say, because every phone on the planet is buzzing with the same message right now. Unknown vessels have entered orbit. Remain indoors. Await instructions. There are no instructions. There is only the ship, and the silence, and the sound of my own heartbeat trying to climb out of my chest. I was not supposed to be a soldier. I was a mechanic. I fixed tractors and old delivery trucks for a living, and the closest I had come to combat was arguing with my neighbor about a fence line. But 3 hours ago, before the sky opened, a voice had spoken to the entire world at once. It did not come through television or radio. It came through everything, all at once, in every language, as if it had reached directly into our skulls and rearranged the air inside them. It called itself the Kryvex Dominion. It said Earth had been classified. It said resistance was not expected and would not be tolerated. It said we had 72 hours to accept new terms, or the terms would be decided for us. I did not understand most of it. I understood the last part perfectly well. Somewhere far above the clouds, in a place none of us could see or touch, there is a council. I would not learn its name for weeks, and even now I only know pieces, gathered second-hand from a defector who trusted me enough to explain things slowly, like I was a child holding a knife for the first time. This council governs hundreds of worlds, judges the worth of civilizations, and decides which species are permitted to grow and which are not. They had been watching us for a long time before we ever knew they existed, watching and filing us under a single, quiet word: primitive. That word did more damage than any weapon fired that day. It meant we were not worth negotiating with. It meant our cities, our music, our arguments about fence lines, our tractors and our coffee mugs, all of it, meant nothing to anyone beyond our own sky. We were livestock waiting to be catalogued. I did not know any of this yet, lying in that ditch. All I knew was that the ship above me kept moving, patient and unbothered, the way a predator moves when it has already decided the hunt is over before it begins. Then the ditch beside me filled with another body, and I nearly screamed. It was Daniel Ashworth, the man who ran the hardware store 2 streets from my house. He had a rifle slung across his back that I doubted he knew how to use, and a look on his face that told me he had made the same trip I had, crawling through backyards and under fences to get away from open ground. He did not ask if I was all right. He asked if I had seen the news before the signal cut out. I told him I had not. He said the last report before everything went dark was that 3 of these ships, these mountains with no sound, had been spotted over other cities. Not just here. Everywhere. Every continent. Every ocean. He said someone on the radio had used the word invasion, and then the radio had gone quiet and had not come back. We stayed in that ditch until the ship passed fully out of sight, swallowed by the horizon the way a whale disappears beneath waves. Only then did we dare to stand. What we saw when we climbed out changed everything for me. I expected panic. I expected the kind of chaos you see in films, people trampling each other, cars crashing into storefronts, the world tearing itself apart before anyone else had the chance to do it for us. That is not what I found. What I found were neighbors standing in the street, calling names, checking on children, forming lines outside the town hall without anyone telling them to. What I found was Grace Sullivan, who taught mathematics at the local school, standing on the steps of the town hall with a megaphone she must have taken from the gymnasium, organizing families into groups, assigning people to check on the elderly, assigning others to gather supplies. Nobody had appointed her. She had simply started, and people had simply followed, because in that moment, doing something felt better than doing nothing. I want to say I understood then what humanity was capable of. I did not. Not yet. All I understood was that fear had not made us small. If anything, it had made us louder, faster, more determined to hold on to each other. By nightfall, every working radio and television in Millbrook carried the same broadcast, relayed from a source none of us could identify. World leaders, speaking together for what felt like the first time in living memory, not from separate podiums, but from a single unified statement, translated instantly into every language on Earth. They confirmed what we already suspected. Ships had appeared over every major landmass. Communications with several of them had been attempted and rejected. The beings inside called themselves the Kriveks, and they claimed authority granted by something called the Galactic Council, a body no government on Earth had ever heard of until that day. The demand was simple, and simply worded, as if to make sure even the least educated among us could understand exactly what was being asked. Earth would submit to Dominion oversight. Our resources, our labor, our future would be managed according to terms we had no part in writing. In exchange, we would be permitted to continue existing in whatever shape they decided was useful. 72 hours. That was the number that echoed through every home, every shelter, every ditch and basement across the planet that night. I remember sitting with Daniel and Grace on the steps of the town hall long after midnight, watching the sky for more shapes, and asking the question that I think every person on Earth was asking at the exact same moment. What happens if we say no? Nobody answered me. Nobody could. But I noticed something in the silence that followed. Nobody suggested that we should say yes either. Grace was the one who finally spoke. She said that mathematics teaches you something important about very large numbers, something that people forget when they are frightened. She said that a single overwhelming force only feels unstoppable when you look at it as one thing, but nothing that large is ever truly one thing. It is made of many smaller things, all connected, all dependent on each other, and every connection is a place where something can break. I did not understand what she meant that night. I would understand it very well before this was over. The next morning brought the first real information any of us had received since the ships arrived. A transmission, broadcast openly, showed footage from a coastal city where a Krivek shuttle had descended to make contact with local officials. The footage was grainy, clearly recorded on someone's phone from a rooftop, but it was enough. I saw them for the first time. Tall, narrow figures, moving with an unnatural smoothness, wrapped in dark armor that seemed to drink the light around it rather than reflect it. They did not speak through their own mouths. A device on their chest translated their words into a flat, toneless version of our own language, stripped of anything that made it sound alive. The officials who met them were not soldiers. They were negotiators, sent in good faith to ask questions, to buy time, to understand what exactly was being asked of us. The Krivek's representative gave them nothing. It repeated the same terms, word for word, as if the humans in front of it were incapable of understanding anything more complicated than a slogan. When one official pressed for details, asked what oversight actually meant in practice, the figure paused and said something that would be repeated on every news channel on the planet within the hour. Detail is not required for compliance. Compliance is required for continuation. That was the moment, I think, when hope and fear finally merged into something else entirely, something colder, and somehow more useful, because in that single sentence, the Kriveks had told us exactly what they thought of us. We were not being invited to a negotiation. We were being informed of a decision that had already been made, by people who had never once considered that we might refuse it. I do not know exactly when the decision was made, or by whom, because there was no single leader giving a single order. It happened the way a wave happens, gathering from 1,000 separate points until it becomes one motion. Governments that had spent decades unable to agree on trade policy suddenly found themselves on shared channels, speaking to each other in real time. Militaries that had trained for wars against each other found their attention turning, all at once, toward a single shared sky. In Millbrook, The change arrived in the form of a truck with a loudspeaker, rolling slowly down the main street just after dawn on the second day. It announced that a regional defense point was being established at the old airfield outside town, and that anyone willing and able to assist in any capacity should report there immediately. It did not ask for soldiers specifically. It asked for mechanics, for engineers, for anyone who understood machines, radios, or metal. I looked down at my own hands, calloused and stained from years spent inside engine housings, and I understood, for the first time since the sky had opened, exactly where I belonged. Daniel walked with me to the airfield. Grace stayed behind to help organize the families still sheltering in the town hall, promising she would follow once the youngest children had somewhere safer to go. I remember she gripped my arm before I left and told me something I would carry with me through everything that came after. She said that the Kryvex had studied our weapons and our cities and our wars, and had decided, based on all of it, that we were simple. She said that was their first mistake, because they had confused simple with small, and those are not the same thing at all. The airfield, when we reached it, was already full of people. Not soldiers in uniform, not yet, but ordinary people carrying tools instead of weapons, forming lines beside a scattering of aircraft and vehicles that looked painfully outdated compared to the silent giants still drifting somewhere above the cloud layer. I remember the strange comfort of seeing so many familiar kinds of fear on so many unfamiliar faces, all of us equally unprepared, all of us arriving anyway. A man near the front of the crowd, wearing a faded flight jacket, climbed onto the hood of a truck and raised his hands for quiet. He introduced himself only as Marcus and said he had spent 20 years flying cargo planes before this, and that he did not know the first thing about fighting something like what was in our sky. But he said he had spent those 20 years learning that machines do not care where they were built, only how well they are understood. He said if we wanted any chance at all, we needed every hand that understood a wrench, a wire, or a circuit, and he needed them now. I raised my hand along with 100 others. That night, for the first time since the ships arrived, I did not sleep in a ditch or a basement. I slept on a cot inside a hangar, surrounded by strangers who had become, in the space of a single day, something closer to family. And somewhere far above us, in a place none of us could see, I imagine now that a council of ancient and powerful beings looked down at our small, stubborn planet, still refusing to answer their ultimatum, and felt, for the very first time, the smallest flicker of doubt. They had expected silence. They had expected surrender. Instead, they had given us a deadline, and we had spent it building. The alarm came at 4 in the morning, and it was not the gentle chime we had grown used to during drills. It was sharp, urgent, the kind of sound that makes your body move before your mind has caught up. I was off my cot and pulling on my boots before I even understood what Marcus was shouting across the hangar. A ship had gone down. Not one of ours, one of theirs. Word spread through the airfield faster than any official channel could carry it. A single Kryvex scout craft, smaller than the mountain-shaped vessels we had grown used to seeing on the horizon, had been struck by something over the eastern hills. Nobody was certain what had brought it down. Some said a lucky hit from an old anti-aircraft battery, repurposed by a militia group. Others said the ship had simply malfunctioned, unused to the density of our atmosphere, or the strange pull of a planet its makers considered beneath notice. Whatever the cause, it had crashed nose first into a field 40 minutes from where we stood, and it was, according to the scouts already racing toward it, mostly intact. Marcus organized a convoy within the hour. I rode in the back of a flatbed truck alongside Daniel, Grace, who had rejoined us the previous afternoon, and a woman named Lucy Bennett, an electrical engineer who had spent the last 2 days rewiring salvaged radios into a shared communication network for the entire region. None of us said much on the drive. I remember watching the sunrise through the slats of the truck bed and thinking that it looked exactly the same as it always had, indifferent to everything happening beneath it. When we reached the crash site, I understood immediately why everyone had gone quiet. The ship was enormous up close, even reduced to wreckage. Its hull, a smooth, dark material unlike any metal I had ever touched, had cracked open along one side, spilling strange light from within, a cold blue glow that pulsed faintly like something breathing. There was no smoke, no fire, none of the violence you would expect from a crash of that size. It had simply come down and stopped, as if it had decided to rest. Two figures lay motionless near the breach in the hull. I will not describe what I saw there in detail. I will only say that they did not survive the crash, and that seeing them up close, still and silent, was the first moment the war stopped being an abstract thing happening in the sky and became something real, something with consequences on both sides. Lucy was the first to step through the breach into the ship itself. I followed, along with 3 engineers from a neighboring town who had arrived ahead of us. Inside, the ship was unlike anything any of us could have imagined. There were no switches, no buttons, no visible controls of any kind. Instead, smooth panels lit faintly when approached, responding to something none of us understood yet, movement perhaps, or heat, or a signal we could not detect. Lucy ran her hand along one panel, and it bloomed with soft light, revealing shapes and symbols that meant nothing to any of us, yet felt, in some strange way, organized, logical. She said something then that I have never forgotten, because it changed the direction of everything that followed. She said that a machine built by a mind, any mind, has to obey certain rules, because physics does not care what species designed it. Power still has to move from one place to another. Heat still has to go somewhere. Information still has to be stored and read. She said if we were patient and careful, we could learn to read this, the same way you can learn to read a language you have never spoken, simply by watching how the pieces fit together. We spent the next 2 days inside that wreck, barely sleeping, taking turns so that no moment went unused. Marcus brought in anyone with relevant skill from 3 counties, aerospace engineers pulled from retirement, hobbyists who had spent years building drones in their garages, a physics teacher named Oliver Hart who kept insisting he was of no use and then proceeded to be one of the most valuable people there, translating strange energy readings into equations the rest of us could actually work with. Daniel, who had spent most of his life selling nails and paint rather than studying advanced technology, found his purpose in an unexpected place. He understood, better than most of us, how ordinary tools could be adapted to unfamiliar problems. When Lucy needed a way to safely tap into the ship's power core without triggering whatever defensive systems might still be active, it was Daniel who suggested using an old insulated cable meant for high-voltage industrial lines, modified with parts scavenged from a farm equipment supplier 2 towns over. It worked. Barely, and with several tense minutes where none of us breathed properly, but it worked. What we found inside that ship reshaped everything we thought we knew about the war ahead of us. The Kryvex weapons were built around a form of directed energy, channeled through crystalline conduits rather than traditional circuitry. Powerful, yes, but also, we discovered, remarkably specific in their tolerances. They were built to operate within narrow environmental parameters, calibrated for worlds with atmospheres cleaner and more stable than our own. Worlds where storms did not carry the kind of electrical interference our planet produced constantly and without effort. Their shields, elegant and nearly impenetrable against conventional explosives, relied on a steady, unbroken field. Interrupt that field, even briefly, and it would need several seconds to fully restore itself. Several seconds. That was the gift buried inside that wrecked ship. A window, small but real, where their advantage briefly disappeared. Grace, who had spent the 2 days at the crash site not touching machinery herself, but instead organizing the flow of information, connecting engineers with each other across regions through Lucy's rebuilt communication network, was the one who first suggested how we might use what we had learned. She said we did not need to match their strength directly. We needed only to find the gaps between their strengths and strike there, together, faster than they expected anything on this planet capable of moving. It took 12 more days to build the first working device, a modified electromagnetic pulse emitter, crude by any standard the Kryvex would recognize, but tuned precisely to the frequency Lucy and Oliver had identified inside the wreck. 12 days of failure after failure, of components burning out, of arguments over which approach was correct, of exhaustion so complete that I fell asleep standing upright more than once against the cold metal of the hangar wall. On the 13th day, word came that a Kryvex patrol vessel, smaller than the mountain ships but still armed and dangerous, had begun a slow sweep of the region, likely searching for the crash site and whatever might have caused it. Marcus made the decision that night, gathering the core group of us in the hangar under a single hanging light, and laying out the plan with a calm that I do not think any of us actually felt inside. We would not attack the patrol vessel directly. We could not with what we had. Instead, we would lure it toward a narrow valley 2 miles from the airfield, using the salvaged remains of a damaged transmitter to mimic a distress signal similar to the kind the Kryvex themselves used. Once it entered the valley, low and slow, searching for the source, we would trigger the pulse emitter, disrupting its shields for the brief window Lucy and Oliver had calculated, and follow with everything else we had managed to gather. Old anti-aircraft guns pulled from a museum and restored to working order. Improvised rockets built from agricultural equipment repurposed for an entirely different kind of harvest. And if all of that failed, a final, desperate measure that none of us wanted to speak of directly, a truck loaded with as much explosive material as we could safely transport, driven by whoever was willing to steer it into the gap left behind. Nobody volunteered out loud, but I remember looking around that circle of tired, frightened, determined faces and understanding that if it came to that, several hands would have risen without hesitation. The next morning, the plan moved into motion. I was stationed near the pulse emitter itself, alongside Lucy, whose steady hands had built most of the device, and who insisted on being present when it was finally tested against a real target, rather than a simulated one. Daniel and Marcus took position with the restored anti-aircraft guns, hidden beneath camouflage netting on the ridge above the valley. Oliver monitored the distress signal, ready to adjust its frequency the moment the patrol vessel showed signs of noticing. Grace remained at the airfield, coordinating everything through the radio network, her voice the calm center that held the entire operation together, even as my own hands shook against the cold metal casing of the emitter. We waited 3 hours before the patrol vessel finally appeared, a sleek, dark shape gliding low over the ridgeline, exactly as Oliver had predicted, drawn by the false signal toward the mouth of the valley. I remember the strange, terrible beauty of it, moving through the morning light without sound, without hesitation, utterly confident in its own invulnerability. It had no reason to expect anything different. As far as its makers knew, we were primitives, simple, beneath notice. Lucy's hand hovered over the trigger, and I watched her count silently under her breath, matching the vessel's descent against the calculations she had made and remade a dozen times over the past 2 weeks. When the ship reached the calculated point, low enough, slow enough, exposed enough, she pressed the trigger without a word. The pulse itself was invisible, a silent wave rolling outward from our position, and for one terrible moment, nothing happened at all. I thought we had failed. I thought all 12 days, all the exhaustion, all the risk, had been for nothing. Then the ship's outer shell flickered, just once, a visible shimmer running along its surface like heat rising from summer pavement, and Daniel's voice crackled across the radio, tight with disbelief and something close to joy. "Shields down, fire now." What followed was not clean, and it was not easy, and I will not pretend otherwise. The restored guns on the ridge opened up, tracing lines of fire across the vessel's exposed hull. The improvised rockets, unreliable things built from farm equipment and desperation, struck true more often than any of us had dared to hope. The vessel banked hard, attempting to climb clear of the valley, its systems clearly struggling to restore the shield in time, and for a moment I believed it might escape entirely, carrying word of us back to whatever commanded it. It did not escape. It came down hard against the far ridge, and this time there was fire, and smoke, and the particular silence that follows when something enormous stops moving for good. We did not celebrate. I want to be clear about that, because I think it would be easy to imagine this as a moment of triumph, and it was not fully. Grace's voice on the radio was steady but quiet as she confirmed the strike, and Marcus, when he climbed down from the ridge afterward, looked older than he had that morning, carrying something heavier than exhaustion in his eyes. We had won. But we understood, all of us, standing together in that valley as the smoke thinned overhead, that this had been a single small vessel, a patrol, nothing more. Somewhere above the clouds, the mountains still waited, patient and silent, and they had not yet begun to notice us at all. That would not last, we all knew it, and in the quiet that followed, standing among the wreckage of the first Kryvex vessel humanity had ever brought down, I understood that whatever this war became, we had just crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. We were no longer simply defending ourselves. We had started fighting back. Word of the valley reached the mountain ships within 4 days, and everything about the war changed the moment it did. The patrols that followed were no longer slow, no longer confident, no longer careless enough to drift low over open ground chasing a false signal. The Kryvex adjusted, as any competent force would, and their response taught us something important about them that would matter for everything that came after. They did not think of us as clever, they thought of us as lucky, a single accident that needed correcting rather than a pattern that needed understanding. That mistake, repeated again and again over the following weeks, became the second gift they gave us, entirely without meaning to. The airfield could not remain hidden forever, and we all knew it. Marcus made the decision to disperse our operations across a dozen smaller sites throughout the region, connected only through Lucy's rebuilt communication network, sharing information but never gathering in numbers large enough to present an easy target. I was assigned, along with Daniel and a new arrival named Priya Malhotra, a former munitions engineer who had walked nearly 60 miles on foot after her own facility was struck in the opening days of the invasion, to a smaller site built into the side of a hill 3 miles from what remained of the original airfield. Priya did not talk much about what she had lost getting to us. I learned only pieces, over shared meals and long nights, spent assembling components by lamplight. She had worked at a research facility that had been developing early defensive systems even before the Kryvex arrived, systems meant for entirely different threats that had seemed, until 3 months ago, like the only kind worth preparing for. When the mountain ships appeared, that facility had been one of the first struck, not because it posed any real danger to them, but because their scans had flagged it as a location with unusually advanced infrastructure for a primitive world. Priya had been outside collecting samples when the strike came. She did not speak about who had been inside. What she brought to our small hillside operation was something none of us had, a deep understanding of how explosive yield could be shaped and directed, not simply released. Under her guidance, the improvised rockets that had served us so roughly in the valley became something closer to precision instruments, still crude by Kryvex standards, but far more reliable, far more capable of striking exactly where we aimed, rather than somewhere close to it. The weeks that followed blurred together into a rhythm of work and waiting and work. We struck at smaller vessels when opportunity allowed, always brief, always careful, always retreating before any larger response could be organized against us. Similar groups, we learned through the network, had formed in dozens of countries, each learning their own version of the same hard lessons, each contributing pieces of understanding back into a shared pool of knowledge that grew faster than any single research effort in human history had ever managed before. It was during this period that I first heard the true shape of what we were up against, relayed to us through channels none of us fully understood, originating, we were told, from someone who had once served the Dominion directly. His name, when I finally met him weeks later, was Kale, and he did not look the way I expected a defector to look. He was Kryvex, tall and narrow exactly as the figures I had seen in that first grainy phone footage, but there was something in the way he moved, hesitant, watchful, that set him apart from every other member of his species we had encountered. He had been part of a logistics division, responsible for calculating supply routes and resource allocation for the invasion fleet, and he had grown increasingly troubled, he told us through a translator built from salvaged Kryvex technology, by what he had learned about the true nature of this war. Kale explained something that reshaped everything we thought we understood about our enemy. The invasion of Earth had not been ordered out of necessity. The Dominion did not need our world, not in any resource sense that mattered to a civilization capable of harvesting entire moons for raw material. The invasion had been authorized as something closer to a demonstration, a test case argued before the Galactic Council itself, meant to prove that low-tier civilizations could be conquered and absorbed with minimal cost, minimal resistance, and minimal oversight from the very body meant to regulate such actions. We were not simply defending our planet. We were the subject of a wager, and every life lost on both sides was a data point being tallied somewhere far above the clouds by beings who had never once considered that the outcome might not go the way they expected. I remember sitting with Priya the night after Kale's explanation was relayed through the network, both of us too tired to sleep and too unsettled by what we had learned to try. She said something then that stayed with me through everything that followed. She said that people who gamble with other people's lives always assume the numbers will behave themselves. She said numbers do not behave themselves. Numbers are made of choices, and choices belong to the people making them, not to whoever is watching from a distance and calling it a wager. The offensive came sooner than any of us expected, and it did not come from a plan drawn up in comfort and safety. It came from necessity. Reconnaissance passed along the network revealed a supply convoy, smaller support vessels ferrying materials and reinforcements between two of the larger mountain ships still holding position over separate continents. Unlike the mountain ships themselves, these support vessels were lightly defended, built for efficiency rather than combat, moving along predictable routes because their commanders had never once imagined a primitive world capable of tracking them across such distances. Marcus called it what it was during the planning session held across a dozen linked radio channels, voices from every corner of the region contributing pieces of the same growing plan. This would not be another ambush fought in defense of our own ground. This would be the first offensive action taken by any group on Earth since the invasion began, a deliberate strike carried out far from home, aimed not at defending a single valley or airfield, but at cutting into the supply lines that kept the entire invasion fleet functioning. Priya led the design of the strike package itself, working with 3 separate teams scattered across different sites to build a coordinated set of devices capable of being deployed from a modified aircraft, one of the few still capable of flight after weeks of scattered fighting, piloted by Marcus himself despite Lucy's repeated and increasingly frustrated objections that his skills were needed elsewhere. I was assigned to the ground support team, tasked with managing the communication relay that would guide the strike package to its target and coordinate the retreat that would follow, successful or not. Daniel worked alongside me, along with Oliver, whose understanding of Kryvex energy signatures had become invaluable for identifying exactly which vessels in any given formation carried the most vulnerable cargo. The night before the operation, Grace found me sitting alone outside the hillside bunker, watching the stars through a gap in the tree cover, wondering, not for the first time, whether any of the distant lights I could see belonged to worlds like the one currently threatening ours. She sat beside me without speaking for a long while, and then she told me something I had never heard her say before, something that made the mathematics teacher suddenly feel very human, very afraid, and very determined all at the same time. She said she had a nephew who had been visiting relatives overseas when the invasion began, and that she had not heard from him in 3 weeks. She said she did not know if he was alive, and that not knowing was somehow worse than any answer she might have received. She said the reason she had thrown herself so completely into organizing the network, into connecting every scattered group of frightened, determined people across the region, was that it was the only way she knew how to keep believing that somewhere out there, the people she loved might still have a chance. I did not have the right words to comfort her, so I simply sat beside her until the sky began to lighten, and neither of us mentioned it again. The operation began just after dawn, time to catch the supply convoy during what Oliver's analysis suggested was a period of reduced vigilance, a pattern observed across 3 separate convoys over the preceding weeks. Marcus flew low, hugging the terrain exactly as we had practiced, while Priya's strike package remained silent and ready in the aircraft's modified cargo hold. I sat at the communication relay with Daniel, watching data scroll across a salvaged screen, my hands steady despite everything inside me screaming that they should not be. Grace's voice remained calm across the network, coordinating updates from 3 separate observation posts scattered along the convoy's projected route, each one confirming the same thing. The convoy was moving exactly as predicted, exactly as vulnerable as we had hoped. The strike itself took less than 90 seconds from start to finish, and I have never experienced anything that felt simultaneously so brief and so endless. Marcus brought the aircraft in low and fast, beneath the convoy's primary sensor sweep, exactly as Priya had calculated. The strike package deployed in a tight, coordinated pattern, targeting the connection points between vessels where Oliver had identified the greatest concentration of shared power distribution. The first vessel's shields failed almost instantly, the coordinated strike overwhelming its defenses before they could stabilize. The second followed within seconds, caught in the same wave of disruption. By the time the convoy's remaining escort attempted to respond, 3 vessels were already falling out of formation, trailing smoke and strange blue light into the morning sky, and Marcus was already banking hard away from the scene, the aircraft shuddering under the strain of a maneuver it had never been designed to perform. We did not escape entirely without cost. A 4th vessel, faster to respond than the others, managed to strike the retreating aircraft's outer wing before Marcus pulled clear of its range, and for several terrible minutes the communication relay carried nothing but static and the sound of Marcus fighting to keep the damaged aircraft in the air. He made it back, barely, and with an emergency landing that tore the aircraft apart on impact. But he made it back, climbing out of the wreckage with nothing worse than a broken arm and a look on his face that told me he understood, better than any of us, exactly how close that had been. The cost came elsewhere, in a place none of us had expected. Priya had insisted on remaining at one of the forward observation posts during the strike, wanting to see the results firsthand, rather than relying on second-hand reports through the network. It was there, in the confused minutes following the strike, that a Kryvex response vessel, dispatched from somewhere along the convoy's original route, located and struck the post directly, having traced the source of the coordinated communication signals back to their point of origin. I learned what had happened through Grace's voice on the network, and I will not pretend that voice remained steady the entire time. She told me, gently, in the careful way people tell you things they know will hurt, that the forward post had been struck, and that Priya had not made it clear before the strike arrived. I do not remember much of the hours that followed. I remember sitting beside the wreckage of Marcus's aircraft, unable to fully process what Grace had told me, while Daniel sat quietly beside me, not offering empty comfort, simply present in the way that mattered most. I think about Priya often, even now. I think about the 60 miles she walked to reach us, about the precision she brought to every device she built, about the way she spoke of numbers as choices rather than fate. I think about the fact that the strike she designed succeeded exactly as planned, disrupting a critical supply route and forcing the Dominion to divert resources toward defense that had, until that morning, been considered unnecessary. I think about the cost of that success every single day. Somewhere far above the clouds, in a place none of us could see, I imagine the wager being reconsidered for the first time. I imagine the numbers no longer behaving themselves quite the way they had been expected to. I imagine, though I will never know for certain, that the loss of 3 supply vessels and the disruption of an entire logistics route registered as more than a simple data point to whoever was watching. But I know, with absolute certainty, exactly what that morning cost us here on the ground, and I carry it with me still, a weight that no strategic victory, no matter how significant, will ever fully balance. We had proven something that morning. We had proven that we could reach beyond our own defenses, that we could strike at the very structure supporting the invasion, rather than simply surviving beneath its shadow. Word of the operation spread through the network within hours, reaching groups on every continent, and for the first time since the sky had opened, I heard something in the voices coming through those channels that had been entirely absent until now. Not relief, not celebration, something quieter, and in its own way, far more dangerous to everything the Dominion had assumed about us. Belief that this could actually be won. 6 weeks after the supply convoy strike, Kale asked to speak with the full network at once, something he had never requested before, and something that told me, before he even began, that whatever he had to say carried a weight beyond anything he had shared previously. We gathered at the hillside site, along with representatives patched in through Lucy's network from as many regional groups as could be reached on short notice. Grace coordinated the call, her voice carrying the same steady calm it always had, though I had learned by then to hear the effort beneath it, the way a person sounds when steadiness has become a skill practiced daily rather than a natural gift. Kale explained that he had maintained contact, carefully and at considerable personal risk, with a small number of individuals still serving within the Dominion fleet who shared his growing doubts about the invasion. Through them, he had learned that word of our resistance, the Valley, the supply convoy strike, and a dozen smaller actions carried out by groups across the planet had reached far beyond the fleet commanders stationed above us. It had reached the Galactic Council itself. I want to explain, as clearly as I can, what the Council actually was, because for most of the war, it had existed for us as little more than a distant, almost mythical authority, a name attached to rules we had never agreed to and never been given the chance to challenge. Kale described it as a governing body formed from representatives of the older, more established civilizations across a significant portion of known space, responsible for settling disputes between member species, regulating the expansion of stronger civilizations into the territory of weaker ones, and, in theory, protecting developing worlds from exactly the kind of unregulated exploitation the Dominion had attempted against us. In theory. Kale was careful to stress that word, and I understood why once he explained further. The Council operated less like a court delivering justice and more like a marketplace negotiating outcomes. Every decision balanced against the interests of its most powerful members, and the Dominion, though not among the oldest civilizations represented, had grown wealthy and influential enough in recent centuries to hold considerable sway over how those decisions were made. The invasion of Earth had not been a rogue action taken without oversight. It had been proposed, argued, and ultimately approved, framed to the wider council as a controlled demonstration of a new approach to absorbing developing worlds, with minimal cost and minimal disruption to established treaties. Our resistance had disrupted that demonstration in ways the Dominion had not anticipated and could not easily explain away. Kale told us that emergency sessions had been called, that representatives from several member worlds, worlds that had themselves once faced similar demonstrations centuries earlier and had not been fortunate enough to survive them intact, were beginning to ask uncomfortable questions about exactly how the Dominion intended to complete what it had started. This was, Kale explained carefully, both the best and most dangerous news he could have brought us. Best, because it meant the invasion no longer existed in isolation, unwatched and unquestioned. Most dangerous, because it meant the Dominion now faced pressure to resolve the matter quickly and decisively, before the Council's growing scrutiny could force a formal intervention that might strip away whatever authority they still held over the operation. Grace was the first to ask the question that mattered most. What would decisive mean, in practical terms, for those of us still standing on the ground beneath those mountain ships? Kale's answer was not comforting, but it was honest, and I had come to value his honesty above almost anything else the war had given us. He believed the Dominion would commit to a single overwhelming strike, gathering the majority of its remaining fleet strength for one coordinated assault intended to end organized resistance permanently, before the Council could intervene and before word of a prolonged, embarrassing conflict could spread further among other civilizations watching from a distance. He also told us something else, something that shifted the entire direction of our strategy in the weeks that followed. He believed the fleet commander overseeing the invasion, a figure he referred to only by a title that translated roughly to something like overseer, maintained direct communication with the Council through a single command vessel, larger and more heavily defended than any of the mountain ships we had encountered so far, currently positioned in geostationary orbit above the region that had once been our original airfield. If we could reach that vessel, Cale explained, if we could access its communication systems directly, rather than relying on intercepted fragments and second-hand accounts, we might be able to present our own account of events to the Council, rather than whatever carefully managed version the Dominion had been sharing. It was, by every reasonable measure, an impossible plan. The command vessel sat far beyond the reach of anything we had built or salvaged so far, protected by defenses that made the patrol vessels and supply convoys we had struck previously look almost undefended by comparison. Marcus, still recovering from the injuries sustained during the convoy strike, argued initially that the risk was too great, that we had already accomplished more than anyone could have reasonably expected, and that reaching for something so far beyond our current capability risked losing everything we had built in a single catastrophic failure. It was Oliver, quiet and unassuming Oliver, who had spent months translating strange energy readings into equations the rest of us could understand, who finally convinced the group otherwise. He pointed out something the rest of us had overlooked in our focus on the vessel's defenses. A command ship of that size, responsible for maintaining constant communication with a council, located an unimaginable distance away, required an equally significant amount of specialized equipment that could not simply be replaced or improvised the way weapons and shields could be. If we could not destroy the vessel outright, perhaps we did not need to. Perhaps reaching it, even briefly, even at enormous cost, would be enough. The plan that emerged over the following weeks was unlike anything we had attempted before. Rather than a strike from a distance, it would require boarding the vessel directly, something the Dominion, according to everything Cale understood about their military doctrine, considered essentially impossible for a civilization at our level of development. Their doctrine assumed that primitive species lacked the coordination, the technology, and frankly the audacity to attempt something as direct as physically infiltrating a command vessel in orbit. That assumption, we hoped, would become their second great mistake. Cale provided what schematics he could recall from memory, supplemented by fragments of data recovered from the wrecked scout ship months earlier. Lucy and a growing team of engineers worked to adapt salvaged Kryvex technology, including components recovered from the supply convoy strike, into a small transport craft capable of reaching orbit, something no human-built vehicle had accomplished since long before the invasion began. Priya's absence weighed heavily over every stage of that work, and more than once I caught Daniel pausing over a half-finished device, clearly thinking of the precision she would have brought to it, before continuing without her. I volunteered for the boarding team almost without thinking, and I remember Grace looking at me with an expression that held both understanding and quiet fear, though she never once tried to talk me out of it. Daniel volunteered alongside me, along with 4 others drawn from different regional groups across the network, each bringing skills the mission would require, from Lucy's technical knowledge of Kryvex systems to a former security specialist named Henry Voss, whose experience with close-quarters procedure, however different our tools were from anything he had trained with, proved invaluable during the weeks of preparation that followed. The transport craft launched under cover of a coordinated diversion, a series of small strikes carried out simultaneously across 3 different regions, drawing attention away from our actual point of departure. I will not pretend the ascent itself was anything other than terrifying. The craft shuddered and groaned in ways that made every one of us certain, at various points, that we would not survive to see orbit at all. Lucy sat beside the improvised controls the entire way, her hands steady despite everything, murmuring corrections and adjustments that somehow kept us intact through forces the craft had never been properly tested against. We reached the command vessel during a window Kale had identified through his remaining contacts, a period of reduced patrol activity along one section of the hull where routine maintenance was scheduled to occur. The vessel up close was larger than anything I had fully processed from the ground, a structure that seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction, its surface marked with the same smooth, dark material we had first encountered inside the wrecked scout ship, now scaled up to something that felt less like a vehicle and more like an entire world unto itself. The boarding itself I will describe only briefly, because I do not think dwelling on it serves any purpose beyond what is necessary to understand what came next. It was not clean, and it was not easy, and there were moments where I genuinely believed none of us would make it back to the transport craft alive. Henry's training proved essential more than once, guiding us through sections of the vessel where Krivek's crew, caught entirely off guard by the presence of intruders their own doctrine insisted should not exist, responded with confusion that, more than anything else, bought us the time we needed. We reached the communication core with less than an hour remaining before the transport's window for safe departure closed. Lucy worked quickly, interfacing salvaged equipment with systems she had only ever studied through fragments and second-hand descriptions, while the rest of us held the narrow corridor leading to the core, aware every second that reinforcements could arrive at any moment. What we found there confirmed everything Kale had told us, and revealed something more. The vessel's logs, once Lucy managed to extract and translate a portion of them, contained direct communications between the fleet overseer and council representatives, spanning the entire duration of the invasion. They confirmed, in language far more explicit than anything Kale had been able to convey secondhand, that Earth had indeed been selected specifically because of its classification as low tier, chosen not out of necessity, but because it represented an ideal test case for demonstrating that developing worlds could be absorbed quickly, quietly, and with minimal cost to the Dominion's resources or reputation. The logs also revealed something Kale himself had not known, something that changed the calculation entirely. The overseer, facing mounting pressure from a council growing increasingly uncomfortable with the prolonged and highly visible nature of the conflict, had recently received authorization to commit the entirety of the remaining invasion fleet to a single final operation, intended to conclude the matter permanently within days rather than weeks. We had found exactly what we came for, and confirmation of exactly the threat Kale had feared most. Lucy transmitted what data she could extract, using a method Kale had provided for reaching a specific council communication channel reserved for emergency reports from member worlds, a channel the Dominion could not easily intercept or suppress without revealing far more than they wished the wider council to know. I do not know, even now, exactly what portion of that transmission reached its intended destination, or how it was received once it arrived. What I do know is that within 3 days of our return to the surface, exhausted, injured in ways both visible and otherwise, but alive, the Council sent its first direct communication to Earth since the invasion began. It arrived not as a demand, not as an ultimatum, but as a single, carefully worded message, broadcast simultaneously to every receiving station our scattered network still maintained. It announced that a council observer would be arriving to assess the situation directly, and that all parties, including the Dominion fleet, were instructed to suspend offensive operations until that assessment was complete. The Dominion did not honor that instruction, not fully, and I would learn why soon enough. But the observer came anyway, descending in a small, unremarkable craft, escorted by nothing, landing in an open field not far from what remained of our original airfield, watched by every camera and every frightened, hopeful set of eyes our network could gather in time. For the first time since the sky had opened, an alien being stepped onto our soil not as a conqueror, but as a witness. I stood among the crowd that gathered at a careful distance, watching that small, unremarkable figure emerge, and I remember thinking, with a clarity that surprised me even in that exhausted, uncertain moment, that we had not won anything yet, not truly, but we had done something the Dominion had never once believed a primitive world capable of doing. We had made them listen. The observer's name, translated as closely as our systems could manage, was something that sounded like Visari, and within a day of arriving, it became clear that the Dominion had no intention of allowing its presence to slow anything down. Kale's warning proved accurate faster than any of us wanted. Rather than honoring the Council's instruction to suspend offensive operations, the fleet overseer moved to accelerate the final assault, calculating, correctly as it turned out, that a swift and complete victory achieved before the observer could file a formal report would leave the Council with nothing left to intervene in. A conquered world required no further oversight. A dead resistance required no further questions. We learned of the coming assault through Kale, who reached us one final time through the network, his voice carrying an urgency that cut through even the translator's flat, toneless delivery. Every remaining Dominion vessel, every mountain ship still holding position across the planet, was being recalled and redirected toward a single coordinated strike, timed to begin within 36 hours. There would be no more patrols, no more supply convoys, no more smaller vessels to pick off one at a time while the larger threat waited patiently above. This would be everything, all at once, aimed at ending the war before Visari's presence could change its outcome. I will not pretend that any of us slept during those 36 hours. The network came alive in a way I had never witnessed before. Every regional group, every scattered site, every remaining piece of the resistance we had built across months of loss and improvisation, coordinating together for the first time, not around a single strike or a single target, but around the survival of everything. Grace, who had spent the entire war holding the network together through calm words and steady coordination, became something closer to a general in those final hours, though she would never have used that word herself. She organized what remained of our scattered defenses into a single, unified response, drawing on lessons learned from every engagement since the crash of that first scout ship. The pulse emitters that had disabled shields in the valley, refined and multiplied 100 times over by engineers across the network. The precision strike techniques Priya had developed, taught and passed forward by those who had worked alongside her, now carried by teams who had never met her but understood, deeply, what her sacrifice had made possible. The boarding tactics Henry had refined, adapted now for defending fixed positions rather than infiltrating enemy ones. Lucy's communication network became the nervous system of the entire defense, linking sensor posts, improvised weapons batteries, and coordination centers across every continent into something that functioned, for the first time, less like a scattered collection of desperate resistance groups and more like a single, unified planetary defense. Oliver worked without rest through those final hours, refining the models he had built over months of studying Kryvek's energy signatures, providing the network with something we had never fully possessed before, genuine predictive understanding of exactly how the incoming assault would likely be structured, based on patterns observed across every previous engagement. I spent those hours back at the hillside site, working alongside Daniel to prepare the region's defenses, checking and rechecking every device we had built, every connection Lucy's network relied upon, every piece of the plan that had grown, almost impossibly, from a single crashed scout ship into something capable of meeting an entire invasion fleet head-on. Visari, the Council observer, remained present throughout those final hours, though I did not see it again personally until much later. Kale, in one of his final transmissions before communication with him, was lost entirely, amid what I can only assume was the chaos of the Dominion's final preparations, told us that Visari had requested, and been granted, permission to observe the coming engagement directly from orbit, rather than from the relative safety of the ground. I do not know what motivated that decision, perhaps genuine curiosity about a world that had, against every expectation, refused to behave the way conquered worlds were supposed to behave, perhaps something closer to disbelief, a need to witness firsthand whether the reports reaching the Council could possibly be accurate. Whatever the reason, when the assault finally began, it began beneath the watchful presence of a witness the Dominion could not silence and could not fully control. The sky, when the fleet descended, was unlike anything any of us had witnessed even in the earliest days of the invasion. Every mountain ship that had held position across the planet for months moved at once, converging from every direction, filling the horizon with shapes that blotted out the morning light entirely. I remember standing outside the hillside bunker, watching that impossible wall of ships gather overhead, and feeling something that was not quite fear, though fear was certainly part of it. It was closer to awe, the same terrible awe you feel standing at the edge of something vast and uncaring, moments before it decides whether to notice you at all. Grace's voice came across the network, steady despite everything, giving the order that set the entire coordinated defense into motion. What followed, I will describe as honestly as I can, because I think honesty matters more here than drama. It was not a clean victory. It was not a single decisive moment where everything turned in our favor. It was hours of chaos, of coordinated strikes launched from 100 different locations simultaneously, of pulse emitters disabling shields across sections of the fleet just long enough for improvised weapons, refined over months of hard-learned experience, to find their targets. It was losses on our side as well, positions overrun, defenders who did not make it through those hours, names that Grace would read aloud, quietly and with visible grief, once the fighting finally slowed enough to count them. But it was also, unmistakably, something the Dominion had never once prepared for. Oliver's predictive models proved devastatingly accurate, allowing Lucy's network to redirect coordinated strikes toward exactly the vulnerabilities the fleet's own formation created, as it attempted to overwhelm a planet it still, even now, fundamentally misunderstood. The Dominion's doctrine, built around the assumption that primitive worlds broke quickly once a fraction of their infrastructure was destroyed, had no answer for a planet that had already absorbed months of losses and had only grown more coordinated, more determined, and more capable as a result. I fought that day in ways I never imagined myself capable of, not out of any natural skill or training, but out of the same stubborn refusal that had carried every person across this network from the first terrified hours after the sky opened to this final, overwhelming moment. Daniel fought beside me the entire time, and I remember, even amid everything happening around us, a strange gratitude that whatever happened next, I would not face it alone. The turning point, when it came, arrived not from a single dramatic strike, but from the slow, grinding accumulation of 100 smaller victories across every region of the network, each one chipping away at a fleet that had expected total, swift dominance and instead found itself bleeding losses it had never budgeted for. By the time the sun began to set on that impossibly long day, the Overseer's remaining fleet, battered and disorganized, began a retreat that no amount of doctrine or confidence could disguise for what it truly was. I do not know exactly what Vasari witnessed from orbit during those hours, but I know what it reported afterward, because that report reached us within days, relayed through council channels that Kale had once described to us, and that now, for the first time, carried a message meant directly for the people of Earth, rather than about them. The message was brief, and I remember every word of it, because Grace read it aloud to the entire network, her voice breaking only slightly at the end. The Council confirmed that Earth's prior classification as a low-tier, undefended world had been found inaccurate, based on demonstrated capability inconsistent with that designation. Pending further review, Earth would be reclassified as an undetermined civilization, subject to formal contact protocols rather than unilateral action by any single member species. The Dominion's invasion was to cease immediately, its remaining forces withdrawn from the system, pending a full inquiry into the circumstances surrounding the operation's authorization. It was not a promise of safety. Kale, who reappeared through the network 3 days later, exhausted and clearly carrying the weight of choices that had likely cost him everything within his own society, was careful to remind us of that. The Council was not a protector, not truly. It was a body that responded to demonstrated strength and disrupted expectation, and we had, against every reasonable prediction, provided both. But he also told us something that mattered more than any formal classification. Word of what had happened here had already begun spreading among other member worlds, other developing civilizations who had, for generations, quietly accepted the same low-tier classifications the Dominion had once applied to us, believing resistance to be as impossible as the Dominion had insisted it was. We had not simply defended our own world, we had proven, to anyone paying attention across an unimaginable distance, that the assumption underlying every unequal arrangement in that wider galaxy could be challenged and survived. I think about that a great deal, even now, months after the mountain ships finally withdrew from our sky, leaving behind a silence that felt, for the first time since this began, like something other than fear. I think about Marcus, who never fully regained full use of the arm broken during the convoy strike, but who insisted on remaining involved in every stage of rebuilding that followed, teaching a new generation of pilots skills that had, until this year, existed only in old films and older stories. I think about Lucy, whose network, built from scavenged radios and desperate improvisation, became the foundation of something far larger once the immediate crisis passed, a genuine effort to understand and prepare for whatever contact with the wider galaxy might bring next. I think about Oliver, quietly continuing his work translating the unfamiliar into the understandable, and about Henry, who spoke rarely of what those hours aboard the command vessel had cost him, but who I noticed, more than once, standing watch long after any threat had passed, unable yet to fully believe the danger was over. I think about Grace most of all, who eventually did receive word, weeks after the final battle, that her nephew had survived, sheltering with strangers who had become, as strangers so often did throughout that terrible year, something close to family. I remember the sound she made when she read that message, a sound that held months of held breath, finally released all at once. And I think, more than anyone else, about Priya, whose precision and quiet determination shaped nearly everything that ultimately allowed us to survive that final assault, and who never learned how the story ended. I do not know exactly what the coming years will bring. Kale remains among us, uncertain of his own place in a world that both owes him a debt and struggles, understandably, to fully trust anyone who once wore the uniform of an invading force. Vasari returned to whatever distant place the Council calls home, carrying with it the first honest account of this world that had ever reached beyond our own sky. Formal contact, we are told, will follow eventually, on terms that will, for the first time, include our own voice in shaping them. What I know for certain is this: we were called primitive, simple, beneath notice, by beings who studied our weapons and our wars, and concluded, with complete confidence, that we would break the way every other world in similar circumstances had apparently broken before us. They mistook simple for small, they mistook desperation for weakness, and somewhere far above the clouds, in a place none of us will ever fully understand, a council that watches over more worlds than I can imagine, now knows, with absolute certainty, exactly how badly that mistake was. I stand sometimes, even now, on the same ridge where I first watched a soundless mountain slide across the sky, and I think about how close we came to simply accepting the terms we were given. I think about Grace's words on the steps of that town hall, about mathematics and very large numbers, about how nothing that vast is ever truly one thing. I think about Priya's belief that numbers are made of choices, not fate. We chose, all of us, together, in ditches and hangars and hillside bunkers scattered across an entire frightened planet, not to accept a future decided for us by beings who never once bothered to ask what we wanted for ourselves. The sky above me now is quiet, the way it used to be before any of this began. But I know it will not stay that way forever, and I know, when the next ships come, whoever sends them will find a very different world waiting beneath the clouds than the one the Dominion once mistook for easy prey. We are still here, we are still standing, and we are no longer simple enough for anyone to underestimate again.